Hey there YouTube, I'm Yukitsu, this is the Yukitsu Times. Welcome to my channel, welcome to a little bit of Battlefleet Gothic Armada 2. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Space Marines. Now the Space Marines was actually the main faction that I ended up playing in the end of Battlefleet Gothic Armada. After they over-nerfed the Eldar and forced them to become a carrier faction, I started playing the Space Marines. They're a very powerful and very interesting faction in that game, and their playstyle hasn't fundamentally overly changed in the new edition. You still want to go in for those massive boarding actions, but the way that you're doing it and the result of doing that is different than it used to be. It used to be that you would be playing as the Space Marines and you would simply board enemy ships, and that would cause them to take a lot of criticals, and then their ship would be a useless limping wreck. Now it's you can actually kill the ships because you're capable of getting kills through the use of your boarding actions by depleting their manpower to zero. Once you do that, their ship essentially sort of limps through space and can't do anything anymore. And this is a fairly interesting change, but at the same time, it doesn't actually change too much of how it played. Like in the previous one, where their ship wasn't completely helpless, it was just almost entirely helpless, this one they can actually replenish the crew, so a ship that's been downed by boarding actions isn't completely out of the game. So anyway, let's look at our skills. We're going to ignore this one because we don't start off with that. Supercharged Void Shield. This is going to be a skill that the Space Marines are going to be taking if they're taking a battle barge. Very impractical in other circumstances. Supercharged Void Shield is just that sort of one where you're trying to tank through a lot of damage and on your capital ship, and there's only really one ship in their fleet that really warrants that kind of tension. That's the battle barge. Typically not a ship that I see with the faction, but there are certain compositions that I would consider using one in. So Supercharged Void Shield is going to be a fairly rare pick for the Space Marines. Next up is the Plasma Bomb. Teleports a bomb to a maximum distance of 10,000 units, blah, blah, blah. Fairly okay one for the Space Marines, especially at the start there. You're definitely going to be switching it out for something better, but this is one of the ones I would definitely consider early on. Auger Probe. This one's actually vital for early game Space Marines, in my opinion. Just because the other four abilities are more situational, this one's going to always be good for the Space Marines because they have got a bunch of abilities that require them to locate the enemy and lock onto them. So if you can land an Auger Probe on a distant ship there, it does make it much easier to hit them with those boarding torpedoes that are capable of homing in on them. And also it helps with their strike craft a little bit if you're going for that route. There's lots of reasons why the Auger Probe is quite good for the Space Marines. Next up is the Disruption Bomb. This one's also very good for the Space Marines against certain fleets. It allows them to burn through enemy shields very, very quickly, which allows them to do their teleport actions a lot more easily without having to worry about burning down their shields with their very, very poor macro weaponry, because Space Marines have very poor ability to strip shields. It takes them a lot longer than it would for a lot of other factions out there. And this is a fairly basic roster of starting skills there. Nothing really terrible, but nothing really stand out. The one thing that I wish was here, in fact, is the Stasis Bomb, because that one's always useful for pretty much every faction, and is a great, well-rounded ability to have access to on your roster. I would argue that you're probably going to be most often taking the Auger Probe and Plasma Bomb, or Auger Probe and Disruption Bomb, one of those two. For upgrades here, Navigational Shields. This is actually pretty good for the Space Marines in a lot of maps there, just because these guys are capable of doing a lot of ambush-style gameplay, and that really can help them out in that sort of context. It also lets them do that style of sitting in terrain out of line of sight of your opponent there, and firing sort of boarding torpedoes at your enemy if they're not doing anything too interesting. Fairly okay ability. It's nothing that you're going to write home about, but depending on what map you end up with, you may want to pick this up. Improved Auger Array, I don't think this is a Space Marine ability. It's a pretty okay one on some compositions, but it's not really going to be one for what they do, which is boarding. And if you're going to be boarding enemies, you're going to be within a very short range. So generally speaking, don't bother with the Improved Auger Array. Next up, you get the First Company Terminators. This only applies to the lightning strike of the capital ship, your flagship there. So not necessarily great, but it's not terrible either. One of the problems with the upgrades for the Space Marines is that they actually are pretty weak from the gate here. Next up, you get the Aurent Pattern Weapons. This applies to your flagship and increases your range by 4,500 and by 4,500 units. This is not a great one for them unless they're even with the battle barges. This isn't an amazing upgrade or anything like that, but it may be situationally useful in some circumstances that I can't really think of off the top of my head. Broadly speaking, you're probably not going to be using this because you're not a macro or lance-focused faction in a certain sense there, and it's difficult to actually gain huge benefits from taking a long-range stance with these guys. Next up, you've got the Disruption Overcharge. This is quite good for the Space Marines. It means that their limited weaponry is cut capable of cutting through shields that little bit of faster, allowing you to do the lightning strikes later on a little bit more reliably. Once you've run out of standard boarding actions, you have to be able to do something to get through shields. And if it's forcing you to go through their shields by just slowly chopping their way through them, this is going to help a little bit with that regard, especially later on in the game when your weapons are damaged, your fleet's damaged, you've got a couple ships missing because they've been destroyed. That's going to be one of the things that you kind of need to have that going on, especially if you didn't take the disruption bomb. All right, so anyway, I think I've clicked edit fleet here and then froze the game, but we'll try and take a look at the other things they've got here. So, fleet creation, Hunter. This is an interesting escort. You can do a similar thing with the Space Marines as you did with the Tau, with the Seeker missiles. The only difference is that after you've run out of your 3 boarding torpedoes, you still actually have 2 regular torpedoes, so you could be throwing those out against the enemy as well. The Hunter is fairly fast. It's a little bit more fragile than the other ones, but it's quite capable of capturing points there. And like I said, you can also use these guys as a sort of cheesy way to cause an enemy to take lots of boarding actions from long distances there. This is actually a pretty decent assault action there. 2 to 3 troop damage per torpedo there. A lot of potential to decrew things with just a bunch of Hunters out there. Other than that, it's pretty typical sort of escort sort of thing there. Fairly inexpensive as well, which makes it good for just running a bunch of these for scans. Next up, you get the Gladius. I would actually prefer having the Nova in this particular fleet. The thing about the Gladius is it's a little bit slower than the Nova and the Hunter, but it does have a decent weapon setup there, 2 double-barrel light macro turrets for a good amount of macro damage, and it's not too expensive. The only thing is that the Nova has actually got the same DPS, but one of those is from lances. It's actually got 2 damage per second light lance artillery, which is really good for an escort. Still the same sort of stats otherwise, the shield and hull values are still bugged, but it's got better speed than the Gladius, making it a better cap ship. So it's just all better than the Gladius. And like the fact that I cannot sort of squeeze more than, well, I can change 1 Gladius for 1 Nova, I guess, but like, yeah, I prefer having sort of matched one so I don't have to pay attention to what I'm clicking on. Anyhow, yeah, like the Nova is just way, way better than the Gladius there in pretty much every sort of matchup there. Kind of ridiculous, actually. Next up, anyway, we got the Vanguard Mark I. Now, one of the things we want to comment on here is that all of the Space Marine ships have 83 armor on all sides. This makes them fairly durable, but they also tend to have little amounts of hit points. This isn't really represented here, but generally speaking, they've got a slightly lower amount of hit points, if I recall correctly, on all of their ships. I cannot remember for sure if that's true anymore, but I believe it is. Like I said, the damn values are bugged, so I have trouble checking for sure. One of the things about this is that, like, just classically speaking, you're going to have less hull points per points cost as well with Space Marines, because the ships are also very expensive. So, despite the fact that you've got 83 armor all around, you're often going to find that the Space Marine fleets feel pretty fragile. You're going to feel as though you're getting blown up pretty easily there. Anyway, Vanguard Mark I here, no exception to that, 83 armor on all sides. It feels like it gets blown up very easily, and it quite often does. A lot of abilities, a lot of stuff going on with this ship, so let's take a look at it. It's got 1 hangar bay here. It's only capable of launching like the 1 wave of fighters, bombers, or boarding ships there. They're pretty good for that role there, just in that you can have quite a few of these ships in all. Next up is the torpedo launcher. It fires 4 of them. It's capable of firing regular and boarding torpedoes. This is actually one of the more powerful variants for this guy, just because the torpedoes are really, really good for this ship. Light macro battery weapons. This is 3 damage per second from macro battery weapons on a 171-point ship. There are escorts that have better macro battery broadsides than this guy, although admittedly you've got 6 if you fire from both sides, but that's basically saying that this thing has as much firepower as a Niksar Dao. I think it's got a similar number of hit points to Niksar Dao as well, but in any event, this is a ship that is designed solely for boarding actions, and for using those torpedoes and those hangar bays to also get more boarding actions. Just boarding actions, boarding actions, boarding actions. It's very, very good at that role. It's capable of getting in there very quickly, getting those boarding actions, those lightning strikes, although the damage for those is not necessarily too high. Next up, you get the Vanguard Mark II. This one's got, instead of the torpedoes, the light lance artillery, and this is actually a fairly powerful variant of this in some ways. It's got 4 damage per second from lance fire. This is pretty decent in terms of just causing some raw damage there. It's not great, however. 4 damage per second from lance looks good, but it doesn't mesh with anything else that this thing has, making it hard to really justify the 184 points that you're paying for this by comparison to the Vanguard Mark I, which is going to be able to sort of run in, use those torpedoes, and really focus on that boarding action playstyle. Lastly, you get the Vanguard Mark III. And if this thing had a full-scale bombardment cannon turret, this would be okay. The light bombardment cannon turret is just too much weaker than the standard one to really make it feel worthwhile here. It feels as though the Vanguard Mark II actually does this thing's job in some ways better. The only thing that's really great about this is that you can use it to broadside, since this can fire to the sides, whereas the lances can't. But I still would say that it's not really a particularly worthwhile thing. So the light cruisers, you're going to typically take these guys. You're broadly speaking, in my opinion, going to want to take the Mark I here. The reason that this fleet is kind of wonky in terms of these 3 ships here is that these things are designed to just run up to opponents while stealthed and then get in tons of boarding actions. It gets in the way having the launch bay and having to pay so much for it, because if these guys didn't have launch bays, they'd probably only cost like 140 points or so, and they're just way overpaying for that sort of feature there. Next up, we get the Strike Cruiser Mark I here. This thing's got 2 carrier bays, bombardment cannon turret, full-scale one, and the macro battery weapons. This thing's actually pretty okay. The full-scale bombardment cannon turret's really powerful. The fact that it's only got one of them really sort of hampers this thing quite a bit there, but 2 carrier capacity on a 242 ship is not the worst thing in the world, especially when it's this durable, fast, and capable of really, really powerful boarding actions. Again, this thing doesn't have the best of synergies, though. If you are going for sort of carrier play, this is probably one of the ones that's going to become the mainstay of this fleet, but it's hard to go full carrier with the Space Marines. They just don't have the capacity for it. A lot of their carrier ships are quite expensive. Next up is the Strike Cruiser Mark II. This one's got the torpedo launchers, and it's quite a lot cheaper. Because of this, I think that for the same sort of role of using the ordnance to do boarding actions, this thing's going to be the go-to pick under a lot of circumstances, just because that lower price cost means a lot. Also, one of the things about the Strike Cruiser Mark II is that the torpedoes cluster together very, very close together, making it sort of all or nothing for torpedo hits, which I think for a ship that's this fast and maneuverable is actually quite a good thing. It means that if you're going to get any hits with your torpedoes, you're going to get all 6 hits. I prefer it that way just a little bit there. Bombardment cannon turret again on this thing, and then the macro battery weapons are again 4 damage per second per side. Again, very, very low damage per second from the macros and stuff like that. The Mark III here, this is the Lance variant. Technically speaking, you get more Lance damage out of the Vanguard Mark II. What makes this guy kind of better is that it's got the bombardment cannon turret as well, which synergizes a lot better than what the Vanguard Mark II is running with. And that's, of course, got the macro battery weapons. This is the only one that doesn't have extra boarding actions, and because of that, it really doesn't fit in well with Space Marines by contrast to the Mark II and the Mark I. I think that this is the sort of one that you may want to go for if you're trying to actually do a little bit of brawling and a little bit of damage with your weapon systems. But again, the weapon systems run into that problem of they don't mesh together very well. They're all sort of different sides, and even then, the damage per second output of a Strike Cruiser Mark III is pretty low. So despite your 83 armor around all sides, you're probably going to lose a damage per second race, especially against any ship that costs 200 points. Lastly, we got the Battle Barge Mark I. Now, this is where you actually get into the realm of having ships that can deal some damage. The macro battery weapons on these guys are kind of crazy in terms of how much damage they're doing. You're looking at 120 damage per volley, just from one side from the broadside here. If it's firing from both of them, that's actually a lot more. Of course, that's only 12 damage per second in total, but that's still a pretty decent amount, especially combined with 3 bombardment cannon turrets. That's 3 damage per second each with insanely high critical rate of these guys. And if you're getting an extra 9 damage per second off this guy, you're looking at potentially focusing a target down for 21 damage per second, which is pretty good for an Imperial-style faction. And not only that, but you're going to be turning them into a hulking wreck just from criticals very, very quickly with this type of ship. This is the ship that you're going to go to if you actually want to deal some real broadside damage. Lastly, you get torpedo launchers and the launch bays here. And you've got 6 torpedo launchers and you've got 3 launch bays. The 3 launch bays is kind of okay, quite nice there. And the 6 torpedoes is also quite nice there. Again, you're looking at a ship that doesn't necessarily synergize super well with itself there, but it doesn't necessarily have to just because the numbers are so kind of good at what they do. This is a very expensive ship, however, 500 points there. What you're hoping to do with this guy is just knock out a bunch of enemy ships really quickly, and once they've all been knocked out, you can sort of go in for whatever's left with some boarding actions maybe or something like that. Anyhow, next up we get the Battle Barge Mark II. I do think this is the inferior version. Got 3 launch bays. We don't have any torpedoes. Instead, you get 2 heavy lance artilleries. This is 6 lance damage per second, which is kind of nice, but it's mixed with the lance turret instead of the heavy bombardment turrets. the 3 lance damage is just pitiful. It's not really enough to make this thing worthwhile, in my opinion. Very, very good long range, but Space Marines don't really work as a good long range artillery faction. Like, I would not want to pay 535 points on a ship that sets itself to attack target ahead of it, lock on target, and just fires for 9 damage per second from lances. It does have very good heavy plasma macro battery weapons. Very, very good damage per second output of that at 18,000 units, but it doesn't have much to do to increase its accuracy at those very, very long range other than go lock on target, which means that this is not actually going to be amazing at that sort of long range exchange either. So, broadly speaking, I'm going to say Battle Barge Mark 1 if you're going to go for a Battle Barge all the way. Nothing really about this one feels appealing to me unless... just nothing about this feels appealing to me under any circumstances there. So our fleet here... you can actually just go pure vanguards, but I find them a little bit money inefficient. The reason that they're powerful is that they can go stealth. And when you've got these guys going stealth, it's very, very difficult to counter the Space Marine fleet that's doing that, because they can get into boarding range without you being able to really do a ton to counterplay that. The Strike Cruiser, on the other hand, just a much more durable, more reliable sort of ship there, capable of acting a bit as a ship of the line there, thanks to the fact that it's got the bombardment cannon turret, which is a very, very powerful weapon. And you're not paying much extra for the Strike Cruiser Mark II over the Vanguard Mark I, despite the fact that the Strike Cruiser has much, much better boarding actions, which is sort of what you're going for with this fleet composition anyway. And the reason that the Vanguard has such a high points cost, really, in my opinion, is probably because of, again, that launch bay. If they didn't have that, the Vanguard spam would probably be a lot more viable. 2 Gladius and a Nova here, just to round off our escorts there and to fill in points. And also they work quite well as capture point sort of fodder. Anyway, let's go ahead and hit ranked here. Again, I don't have to select my abilities until I know what we're up against, what the map looks like, and all that other stuff. Yeah, I think that out of all the factions, like, Space Marines must be, like, the most one-dimensional one. But that doesn't mean that they're any less powerful because of that. I think they are slightly hard-countered in certain matchups. They do really, really poorly against orks, in my opinion. Or at least I find it hard to use these guys against things like orks, because the orks actually just... they have so many troops that you can sort of end up overwhelmed by that. Alright, so this is going to be coming down to whether or not I can catch him. Otherwise, he's going to be able to just burn me down. If he's got splinter torpedoes and he's really good at using them, I'm going to also have a really rough time on that. One of the problems with the particular fleet composition that I've got here, I don't have very good ability to gain vision. So we are definitely going to go with the Disruption Bomb. I've had Disruption Bombs not work against this. I'm not actually sure if it is bugged. It is supposed to work on Shadow Fields, though. There's not a ton of terrain here. I'm not necessarily sure if I want to go nav shields here. I think I will, actually. Then we can go with this, because it also actually does damage to Shadow Fields. So, I'm going to get you guys group 3 here. We're going to have them sort of loop around. Actually, no, I need to keep my fleet together here. We'll have these guys sort of helping out over here. I kind of dislike that it doesn't... Yep. And these guys last. I'm going to have these guys pushing up towards this point, I think, as well here. Since they're stealthable, I can sort of get out of a bad situation if I have to. Alright. So that means this group's going to be back here, trying to be a bit safe. I like how he basically just starts on top of points because he's so fast. Engines, 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 engines. Now, because of what he's picked, I might actually go for the ships that are over here. and let's use Stormhawk interceptors to get ourselves a little bit of leeway here. Could actually just launch some regular old torpedoes here. Look how tightly clustered they are, though. Like, it's hard to hit long-distance targets with these because they don't spread out at all. Like, there's laser focus, but if you do hit from long range, you're basically, like, amazing. So he had lost his shadow shields over there, but I got some decent extra vision here thanks to the fighter waves, but looks like he lost movement on some of his ships on the flanks there. All right. Oh, shit. All right, so got some good hits with that bombard there. That's good. Have you guys set to that. Mark these ships. See if I can get a lucky hit with that thing. I think I must have gotten hit by some splinter torpedoes there. Alright, so managed to catch up to the Dark Eldar here. Took a lot of damage in the process, but you know what? That's fine. There we go. Oh, our Nova got destroyed there. Oops, that's Thunderhawk Annihilators. That's the wrong thing. Uh-oh. Well, this guy's in trouble. Let's go ahead and do this. There we go. Oh, I'm gonna lose this torpedo. Shit. Okay, well, that was a bad idea. Oh no, okay, they're working. That was overkill, but you know what? It's fine. I don't want that to be recoverable. Alright, and then this guy, let's call to arms against it. I don't know why he's letting me ram here. Alright. And we're just going to get for normal torpedoes here. Oops. Guess from our admiral. Uh-oh. Alright, and there's a win. So yeah, this is why I think the vanguards are actually quite necessary sometimes, is because if you're against a fast opponent, they help a lot. Managed to actually like only board through a lot of, maybe 3 of his ships I think, but yeah, ramming also helped quite a lot. What did he have here? Venom shards? King Crew batteries. Yeah, he shouldn't have taken King Crew batteries against Space Marines. If you're looking at this, it only does the scythe missiles, which don't really do that much damage against things like Space Marines. I think the disruption overcharge and like the auger probe and the disruption bomb definitely the way to go in this particular match. I think that's actually a fairly rough match for the Dark Eldar in some ways, just because the Space Marines have that ability to catch up to them and keep on their tail pretty effectively. And they have a hard time with lightning strikes, in my opinion. Like, Dark Eldar are not exactly the most resilient of the Eldar factions against getting lightning striked a bunch of times, and if that happens to them, they can end up in real serious trouble. And also, just it's hard not to get rammed in that particular matchup sometimes. So I think that that was probably also a bad matchup for my opponent in some sense there. But yeah, I think that the Space Marines are quite a powerful faction. I think there's going to be a lot of fairly good players using them. The way that you counter the Space Marines is you really just go after one small ship at a time. If you can destroy a Vanguard, it's a lot of boarding potential that's completely destroyed. Because it basically is, do you run out of like boarding actions before your opponent's completely dead is how you deal with Space Marines. And if the answer is you've forced him to run out of all of his boarding actions before you've been destroyed, then you've won. That's sort of how you deal with the Space Marines. Just, you know, replenish your ships that he has to overboard it with a lightning strike or something like that, because if you've only got one guy in the ship there and he has to use a full lightning strike to deal with that, that's going to help a lot. Although if he just has call to arms, he'll just use call to arms. Or honor the chapter, sorry, honor the chapter. But yeah, it's just the way that you play these guys. You try and get in range of the enemy ships there, you board as many as you can to either cripple them or destroy them. Once you've gotten one that's sort of isolated, you try to destroy it, because if you don't actually destroy it, they'll just recrew it. And yeah, that's Space Marines. So anyway, I hope you found this video enjoyable. I know I like playing as the Space Marines. They're one of my favorite factions to play as in this game. Forgot to switch it over to the Dark Angels, but whatever. So anyway, hope you found this video enjoyable. And of course, as always, I hope to see you guys all next time.